Why did he take our money? Dee? The question came from the back seat in a small voice, the voice of a 7-year-old boy who had not yet learned that some questions don't have answers that make sense, and that the adults around him had already learned to stop asking them out loud. Delaney was 13 years old the first time she watched her father get pulled over on a Texas highway, and the memory had never softened the way most childhood memories do, had never blurred at the edges or lost its color with time. It stayed sharp. It stayed exact. The way the afternoon light hit the patrol cruiser's windshield, the way her father's hands went to the roof of the car without being asked, the movement so practiced and immediate that it told her everything about what kind of world she had just been born into, even if she didn't have the language for it yet. The deputy had been a thick-shouldered man who barely glanced at her father's license before walking to the glove box and removing the envelope of cash that had been sitting there, grocery money, her mother's birthday money. 3 weeks of careful saving, and announcing that it looked suspicious that he'd be holding on to it pending investigation, that her father was free to go. No arrest, no citation, no receipt. Just gone like it had never existed, like her family's money had simply decided to belong to someone else the moment a badge touched it. Her father never filed a complaint. He explained to Delaney later quietly while her mother was in the other room that filing a complaint with Cedar Ridge County meant filing it with the same department that had just taken the money, and that in this county the badge was the complaint department. He said it the way he said other things that were true and terrible, without drama, without bitterness, the way you describe weather. Jalen had been too young to understand the explanation. He had just kept asking on the drive home in the particular way that 7-year-olds ask questions. They sense the adults around them are trying not to answer. Why did he take our money, Dee? Was it really suspicious? What does suspicious mean? Will we get it back? 21 years later. Delaney Voss sat in a rental car at a gas station off Interstate 10, staring at a Cedar Ridge patrol cruiser parked at the pump 30 meters away, and heard her brother's voice in her head as clearly as if he were still 7 years old in the back seat of their father's Buick. Jalen was 28 now, a PhD student at UT Austin. He had saved $8,400 over 14 months. Not grocery money, not birthday money, but tuition money, carefully accumulated, kept in a cash envelope in his center console because the bank transfer hadn't cleared yet and he needed it liquid for the registrar's office. 3 weeks ago, on this same highway, Officer Quill had taken it from him on the side of the road with the same ease with which a man takes something he believes was always his. But it wasn't Jalen's pale, quiet voice on the phone that had made Delaney drive to Texas. It was what Jalen told her afterward, almost as an afterthought, as if he wasn't sure it was relevant. He had not been alone in the car. His 10-year-old nephew, Benji Delaney's cousin's boy, small for his age, and serious in the way that only certain children are serious children, who notice more than adults give them credit for, had been in the back seat on his way to a weekend soccer tournament in Austin. Benji had watched everything. The flashing lights, the screaming, the money leaving his uncle's hand. And since that afternoon, Jalen said Benji had not talked about it. Not once. Not a single word. That silence was louder than anything Delaney had heard in 9 years of federal work. She had driven to Texas because a 10-year-old boy had gone quiet in a way that children should never go quiet, and because somewhere on this highway the man who had done it was still out there. Still waiting behind billboards, still smiling that slow, satisfied smile. She was here to make him stop. Officially, Special Agent Delaney Voss of the FBI's Public Integrity Unit was on administrative leave. The Chicago operation 3 months ago had been textbook in every way, except the part where a warehouse door came off its hinges and caught her across the ribs, and her supervisor, a careful man named Greer, who had never in 15 years told her to do anything she actually did, had handed her 30 days of mandatory rest with the kind of expression that suggested he already knew she wasn't going to take it. She had taken 11 days. Then she had driven to Texas. 9 years in federal law enforcement had given Delaney a particular kind of mind, the kind that couldn't stop cataloging, that turned everything into a pattern, and then couldn't rest until the pattern had a name. She had run Harlan Quill's name through the FBI's law enforcement database the same night Jalen called, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop, and what she found had kept her awake until 3 in the morning. Not because it was surprising, but because it was so relentlessly, depressingly familiar. 14 formal complaints against Quill over 6 years. 0 disciplinary actions. 2 commendations from Sheriff Declan Holt, Cedar Ridge County's elected head of law enforcement, a man whose campaign signs still dotted the county roads with the phrase, "Protecting our community," in red, white, and blue letters that must have looked like a joke to every person Quill had ever stopped on I-10. She had found 4 other victims willing to talk all black, all out-of-state plates, all driving vehicles that Quill had apparently decided were too well-maintained for their owner's comfort level. And all of them had made the same calculation Jalen had made, which was that reporting the theft to Cedar Ridge law enforcement was roughly equivalent to reporting a robbery to the robber. They had gone home. They had absorbed the loss. They had told themselves, or been told by the people around them, that this was just how it was in certain counties, on certain roads, in certain parts of the country that had simply never gotten the memo about the 20th century. Delaney did not accept "that's how it is" as a terminal diagnosis. She had not come to Cedar Ridge in her government-issued SUV with her service weapon on her hip and her badge visible from 50 meters. She had come in a nondescript rental with Illinois plates, dressed in jeans and a plain white t-shirt, her natural hair pulled back, wearing no jewelry, nothing that marked her as anything other than a woman passing through. The FBI credentials were in her purse on the passenger seat, present, but not announced. What was not visible was everything else. A 4K dashcam mounted behind the sun visor, its lens no larger than a pen tip, streaming live footage directly to a secure DOJ server in Quantico. A silent emergency beacon wired into the rental's chassis, GPS, linked to a tactical team staged at a truck stop 8 minutes north on I-10-3. Suburbans, 12 agents full gear waiting for the signal. A federal warrant signed and ready covering Quill Holt and every deputy who had ever looked the other way sitting in a judge's inbox with a timestamp of 6:47 that morning. The night Jalen called his voice had been the voice of a man who had been humiliated so completely he'd gone past outrage into something quieter and more frightening. A kind of resigned exhaustion that Delaney recognized, because she had heard it in her father's voice, the evening he explained why he hadn't filed a complaint, and she had recognized even then, at 13 years old, that that exhaustion was exactly what men like Quill counted on. She was not exhausted. She was precise. She pulled out of the gas station, her hands at 10, and 2, the Texas sun burning white overhead, and she thought of Benji in the back seat of Jalen's car, watching absorbing, going silent. This ends today, she thought, and turned onto Interstate 10. East Texas in July was a particular kind of beautiful if you were from somewhere else and didn't know what it meant. The pine trees thick and green on either side of the highway, the sky so wide and blue it looked manufactured, the air shimmering off the asphalt in waves that turned the road ahead into a mirage of water that retreated forever, no matter how fast you drove toward it. Delaney had grown up close enough to this landscape to know that beauty and danger had always occupied the same address out here, that the same flat stretch of highway that looked peaceful at 70 miles an hour had been for a very long time. A place where certain people stopped being travelers and started being targets the moment they crossed a county line. She drove at exactly the posted limit. Her hands stayed at 10 and 2. She used her turn signal even when there was no one behind her out of a habit she'd built deliberately, because she had learned early in her career that the safest thing a black woman could be in a traffic stop was the most undeniable motorist on the road, not because it guaranteed safety, but because it removed every single excuse before it could be invented. The irony of that, of having to be more careful, more correct, more legible than anyone else just to occupy the same road, was not lost on her. It never was. She just didn't have time for it right now. She passed the Cedar Ridge town limits sign at 11:39 a.m. The town itself was small and looked the way small Texas towns always looked. A gas station, a diner with a hand-painted menu in the window, a Baptist church, a feed store, a hardware store, a water tower with the county name painted on it in letters that had been retouched enough times the paint was thick and layered like sediment. It looked ordinary. It looked like nothing happened here. She knew that the ordinary-looking ones were always the hardest to dismantle because they had spent decades making sure that nothing about them invited a second look. 2 miles past the town limits, she saw the Big Earl's BBQ billboard, massive sun-bleached, the cartoon pig on it, grinning with the specific enthusiasm of something that didn't know what it was advertising, and there nosed out from behind its right edge the front quarter of a Cedar Ridge patrol cruiser. Still. Patient. The way predators are still and patient when they have no reason to hurry, because the prey always comes to them. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She let her eyes pass over the billboard the way any driver would casually without weight, and she noted the time, 11:47, and she kept driving. She thought of Benji. She thought about what it does to a 10-year-old to watch an adult he loves be stripped of dignity on the side of a public road in broad daylight with other cars passing and not stopping, the whole world continuing to move as if nothing was happening. She thought about how that kind of silence, that absence of intervention, teaches a child something about how the world is organized and how that lesson once learned is very hard to unlearn. The cruiser pulled out behind her at 11:48. Smooth, unhurried. Delaney checked the dash cam with a single glance. Recording. Uploading. Everything live. She took one slow breath through her nose, let it out through her mouth, and said to the empty car very quietly, "They're about to get an answer." The blue and red lights came on a moment later, flooding her rearview mirror with color. Delaney pulled over with the kind of precision that comes from having been trained to do the opposite of everything your instincts tell you to do in a moment of fear. Signal right, ease off the accelerator, gradually find the widest shoulder. Steer slow and smooth. Come to a complete stop. Transmission in park engine, off all 4 windows down before the other car has even stopped behind you. She placed both hands on top of the steering wheel. Fingers spread open, and she waited. In her side mirror, she watched Officer Harlan Quill get out of the patrol cruiser, and she took a moment to let the camera capture him clearly, because the camera needed to see what she was seeing. A broad, heavy-framed man whose platinum hair was cropped close under the brim of a campaign hat he wore tilted slightly forward so the shadow fell across his eyes in a way that made it look like he wanted the darkness to do his introducing for him. His uniform strained across the chest and shoulders. He moved the way men move when they have never once been told to wait their turn, with the unhurried proprietorial ease of someone who believes the road exists primarily for his benefit, everyone else present on his sufferance. He did not come to the window. He stopped at the rear of the car and he slapped the trunk. Not touched it, not placed a hand on it, but slapped it. A flat, heavy crack of palm against metal that sent a vibration through the chassis that Delaney felt in her seat. It was a fingerprint maneuver, technically a way to mark that he had made contact with the vehicle, but the particular way he did it, the force of it, the sound of it, was not technical. It was a greeting. It was him, saying hello in the only language he had ever needed. He came to the window at his own pace. He leaned down. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask for license and registration. He let his mirrored sunglasses sweep the interior of the car with the slow consumer satisfaction of a man inspecting something he's already decided belongs to him, chewing a toothpick with the loose jaw of someone who has nowhere to be. That matters more than this moment. "You know how fast you were going, darling," he drawled, the word darling, landing with the particular weight of a word used not as an endearment, but as a diminishment, a way of making her smaller, before the conversation had even properly started. "I was going under the limit, officer." Delaney replied, her voice level and unhurried, not matching his register, not giving him the tremor he was listening for. He told her his radar had her at a higher speed, that it was reckless driving in a construction zone, and she told him calmly and factually that there had been no construction signs for miles, a fact he couldn't dispute and didn't try to because disputing it wasn't the point. The point was the dynamic. The point was making her feel wrong about the facts she knew were true. The toothpick hit the gravel. The shift in his demeanor was total and immediate. The loose jaw tightened. The mirrored lenses came down to her level. The hand at his side moved backward toward his hip with the slow, deliberate weight of a man reminding you what he's carrying. He called her girl. She corrected him once, clean and without heat, the way you correct something that is simply incorrect. He leaned in closer. She could smell him now. Stale coffee and tobacco, and the specific, stale warmth of a man who had spent too many hours in a car telling himself he was important, and he told her she was in Cedar Ridge now. And in Cedar Ridge, he addressed people however he saw fit, and she was going to step out of the car. "Am I under arrest?" she asked. His hand unsnapped the retention strap on his holster. She stepped out slowly because every movement had to be deliberate and visible and unambiguous because the camera was capturing all of it, and what the camera needed was the truth told in real time, not reconstructed later in a courtroom from memory and competing testimony. The heat hit her the moment she cleared the door, the full physical weight of a Texas midday, the sun pressing down with the particular intensity of a place that doesn't apologize for itself. And Quill was already crowding her space, using the architecture of his body to make the geography of the shoulder feel smaller, the way men do when size is the only argument they have left. The pat-down was rough and intrusive, and lasted longer than it needed to. His hands moving with the particular slovenliness of someone who knows there are no consequences for being thorough in the wrong ways, and Delaney held still and counted seconds, and kept her breathing steady, and thought of nothing except the dash cam and the upload speed, and the fact that 8 minutes north on this highway 12 people in tactical gear were sitting in 3 black Suburbans waiting for a single GPS signal. Then he said he smelled marijuana. She had never smoked anything in her life, and he knew that as well as she did, and they both knew exactly what the statement was, not an observation, not a suspicion, but a door being opened onto a room that he had built specifically for this purpose. A room where he could search the car and find whatever he decided to find or take whatever he decided needed taking, and call it law. She did not argue. She noted the timestamp in her head, 11:53 a.m., and she filed it. 80 meters back on the other side of the highway, a battered farm truck had pulled partially onto the gravel shoulder. Behind the wheel was Della Pruitt, 54 years old, a cattle rancher from the next county over who had been driving this road since before Cedar Ridge was anything but a wide place in the road, and who had 2 years ago driven past a scene not entirely unlike this one, a young black man standing with his hands on the hood of his car while Quill counted cash on the trunk lid, and had kept driving and had told herself it wasn't her business, and had thought about it on and off ever since, in the particular way that things nag at you when you know you left them unfinished. Today she had slowed down. Today she had pulled over. And now she had her phone out the window, her elbow braced against the door frame, the camera steady in a way her hands were not. Quill demanded her purse. She told him her badge was inside. He laughed a loud, barking performance of a laugh the kind designed to travel, designed to be heard by no one in particular and everyone within earshot, and he mocked the word badge back at her with a theatrical contempt that she recognized as the sound of a man who was mocking preemptively, who had learned that if you laughed first, you controlled the room. He did not check the credentials. He refused to because checking them meant accepting the possibility of being wrong, and Harlan Quill had spent 22 years building a life on the understanding that he was not the kind of man who was wrong on his own road. Instead, he turned slightly away from her and keyed his radio with the practiced ease of a man making a routine call, and what came out of his mouth was not a request for backup or a status report or anything that had to do with law enforcement in any meaningful sense. It was a transaction, "I've got a target," he said, his voice dropping casual like he was discussing the weather. "Solo female out of state, looks like she's got money. I'm going to shake the tree. Cut me in for 20. The voice that answered was Sheriff Declan Holtz, and the dash cam microphone, its sensitivity rated for exactly this kind of ambient capture, caught every syllable of both sides of that conversation and pushed it in real time to a server in Quantico, where a federal judge's assistant was watching a live feed. Della Pruitt's hands had stopped shaking. She held the phone very still. Quill moved to the passenger window with the proprietary ease of a man who had stopped thinking about whether he was allowed to do the things he was doing a very long time ago, and he reached into the car and picked up Delaney's purse from the seat without asking, without cause, without hesitation, a direct violation that the dash cam recorded at 11:57 a.m. in 4K resolution with GPS coordinates embedded in the metadata. He opened the badge wallet. There was a pause. Brief. Not long enough for most people to notice, but Delaney noticed because she was watching for it. The pause of a man who has seen something he didn't expect to see and is deciding very quickly what to do about it. Then he closed the wallet, and he put it in his breast pocket. He pocketed the federal badge of a sitting special agent of the FBI. The temperature of the moment shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "You just made a significant mistake," Officer Quill, Delaney said, and her voice had dropped an octave and lost the careful, controlled neutrality she'd been maintaining since the stop began. Not because she was afraid, but because the time for performing the role of uncertain civilian was over. Because the moment he pocketed that badge, he had crossed from harassment into a federal crime, and the conversation they were having now was a different conversation than the one they'd been having before. He announced into his radio that the suspect was resisting. He said it flatly, with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to narrate events on audio in ways that would hold up later, that would create a record contradicting whatever the civilian in front of him might eventually claim happened. He said it while she stood perfectly still on the gravel shoulder, with her hands visible and her feet planted, and her face giving him absolutely nothing to work with. She did not move. She did not argue. She existed in front of him with a solidity that was itself the most destabilizing thing she could have done, because men like Quill knew how to process fear, and how to process compliance, and how to process anger. And what they did not know how to process was a person who simply refused to be smaller than they were. He told her to get on her knees in the gravel. She looked at him with her dark eyes steady as water in a bowl, and she told him kneeling on gravel without lawful cause was not a command she was going to follow. Across the highway, Della Pruitt moved forward slightly on her seat, braced her elbow harder, and held the frame. The rotor sound was not yet audible. It was still too far north, still tucked below the tree line, still 8 minutes out by the clock. But by another clock, the one running in the DOJ server room in Quantico, where a supervisor had just stood up from his desk and picked up a radio, it was already much closer than that. Quill squared his shoulders. He looked at her the way men look at things that are continuing to exist against their wishes. He had a gun on his hip, and 22 years of a county that had never once told him no. And he was going to use both of those things to end whatever this was and convert this woman's car, and whatever cash was in it, into another line in the informal ledger he kept in the same mental file as the boat and the truck and the new fence posts on his property. He reached back. His hand found the grip, and Delaney's thumb, resting on the side of her outer thigh, pressed the emergency beacon. 1, she said. 2. The Glock came out of the holster with the practiced speed of a man who had drawn it many times before and never once faced consequences for the drawing, and it leveled at Delaney's chest with the particular steadiness of someone who believes the weapon in his hand is the last word in any conversation. The argument that ends all arguments, the thing that makes the world sort itself out into the arrangement he prefers. She raised her hands, palms out, and she did not drop and she did not scream, and the absence of those two things, the screaming, the dropping, seemed to confuse him in a way she had expected and accounted for, because men who draw weapons on unarmed people are counting on a specific response, have built their entire authority on the reliable production of that response. And when it doesn't come, something in them starts to crack along lines they didn't know were there. She looked past the barrel of the gun, past the man holding it directly into his eyes, and she began to speak. Her badge number, her unit designation, her case file number. She recited them at a measured pace, not fast, not slow, the way you say words you have rehearsed. Not because you are performing, but because you know they are true, and you want them on the record in that order at this time, spoken clearly in a voice that did not shake. He yelled at her to stop talking. She did not stop. She told him the emergency beacon had been active for 4 minutes. She told him her team had a confirmed GPS lock on her position. She told him everything occurring on this road was being recorded on multiple devices and uploaded in real time to a federal server, and that the call he had made 10 minutes ago to Sheriff Holt had also been captured in full. He lunged. Not shooting, not yet. Not in full daylight on a public highway, with a news cycle that had changed since the last time he thought he could do that without consequence, but lunging forward with the gun barrel swinging in a downward arc aimed at the side of her head. The particular violence of a man who has run out of other tools and is reverting to the oldest one. Delaney moved. It was not a large movement. It was the precise, economical movement of someone who had trained for this in a gym in Quantico for the better part of a decade. A drop and pivot that took her out of the arc, a left-hand redirect that pushed his wrist outward, and a right-hand strike to his solar plexus that put enough force into a 2-inch contact point to collapse his diaphragm completely and empty his lungs in a single wheezing rush. He stumbled. The gravel shifted under his boots. The gun went skyward. Across the highway, Della Pruitt's hands were completely still. Quill found his feet, his face a shade of red that had moved past anger into something biological. Pure humiliation, the kind that bypasses thought entirely and goes directly to the oldest part of the brain, the part that doesn't negotiate. He raised the gun again. His eyes had gone flat and wide. "You are dead," he said, and he meant it. The sound arrived before the vehicles did. It came from everywhere at once, the low building percussion of rotor blades dropping from above the tree line to the north, and simultaneously the scream of rubber burning against asphalt from the same direction, 3 black Suburbans coming down the wrong lane of I-10 at speeds that left long dark signatures on the pavement. The helicopter broke cover and banked hard, dropping altitude fast. The white FBI letters on the blue fuselage catching the noon sun like a signal, and the rotor wash reached them a half-second later, a wall of displaced air that picked up the roadside dust and threw it in every direction at once. Quill looked up. He looked down at his chest. There were laser sights on him, not 1, not 2, but a constellation of red points that bloomed across the front of his uniform shirt as the Suburban's doors came open, and agents in full tactical gear flowed out onto the highway with the specific terrible efficiency of people who have been waiting very patiently for exactly this moment. His gun arm began to lower. Slowly. The way something goes down that is not going to come back up. The arrest was swift and clinical, and Delaney watched it with the detached attention of a woman reviewing the results of a calculation she had run correctly. Quill went face down on the gravel, not gently, because the agents who reached him first had seen the footage and knew what he had done and what he had been about to do, and their professionalism was intact, but their gentleness was not. And the zip ties went on with a tightness that would leave Marks and Special Agent Preston Vale tall and bearded. Her partner of 4 years knelt beside Quill and read him his rights, in the flat, measured voice of a man who had done this enough times to know that the words mattered even when the moment didn't feel like it. I didn't know Quill set into the gravel, which was already the first lie of his new life. Delaney crossed to the patrol car, leaned in through the open window, and keyed the radio. "This is Special Agent Delaney Voss, FBI, Public Integrity Unit. She said, her voice carrying clean and level across every scanner frequency in Cedar Ridge County, heard in every cruiser in dispatch in the station and in the sheriff's department building, where Declan Holt would pick up his phone 30 seconds later to call Quill and find the line ringing into nothing. Unit 4 Alpha is in federal custody. Tell Sheriff Holt the coffee should be on when we get there. She dropped the mic. It swung by its cord. She walked back to retrieve her badge wallet from Quill's breast pocket herself without ceremony, the way you take back something that was always yours. Then she heard footsteps on the gravel from across the highway, unhurried but purposeful, and she turned to see Della Pruitt crossing toward her, still holding her phone, the video still running. Della was a solid woman with the particular weathered quality of someone who has spent most of her life outdoors, and her face carried the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere after taking a long time to get moving. She held out the phone. "I got all of it," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "What do you want me to do with it?" Delaney looked at the phone, looked at the woman. "Send it to yourself first," she said. "Then send it everywhere." Della posted the footage to the Cedar Ridge Community Watch Facebook group at 12:31 p.m. It had been shared 3,200 times before 1:15 when a San Antonio news affiliate picked it up and put it on their afternoon broadcast. By the time the FBI convoy turned into the Cedar Ridge Station parking lot at 1:40, the clip had passed 180,000 views, and the governor's press secretary had already called the FBI field office twice, not out of moral outrage, but out of the particular urgency of a political office that has just realized it is standing too close to a fire. Delaney stood in the station parking lot and watched agents carry boxes of files through the front door and into the backs of vehicles, and she thought about the calculation that Quill had been making year after year on this highway. The calculation that certain people could be robbed in broad daylight because they would not be believed, because no one would stop, because no one would film, because the weight of the badge would always land heavier than the word of a traveler passing through. She thought of Benji, 10 years old, silent since the day he sat in the back seat of a car on this highway and learned in the worst possible way what certain roads were. Someone should have stopped sooner, she thought. Someone just did. The interrogation room in Cedar Ridge Station had wood paneling and a fluorescent light that buzzed like something trapped, and the specific accumulative smell of a place where a great many unpleasant things had been done with official sanction over a very long period of time, and Quill sat in the middle of it, handcuffed to a metal table, with the look of a man whose entire personality had over the past 2 hours been itemized and removed. Delaney came in holding a file folder and dropped it on the table with a weight that came from what was inside it, rather than from the folder itself, and she stood across from him without sitting, because sitting would have made this feel like a conversation between equals, and it was not. She did not offer him water. She told him she was sure he'd been thirsty when he left 2 college students handcuffed in the back of a locked car in 98-degree heat outside Beaumont. She watched the name land on him and watched him decide not to say anything, which was the first intelligent decision he had made all day. She walked him through it without drama. The dashcam audio. The private call to Holt. The 14. Prior complaints that had somehow become 2 commendations. The assets that had been seized and logged into thin air. The boat bought in cash. The same month, a Houston contractor lost $12,000 on this stretch of highway. The phone records showing 47 calls between Quill and Holt during traffic stops over the past 3 years, the offshore account receiving wire transfers in amounts just small enough to avoid automated flags. She put the federal RICO charge on the table last because she wanted him to have context for it, wanted him to understand that it was not the beginning of the story, but the conclusion of one, and that the conclusion was comprehensive and final in ways that a good lawyer might be able to sand around the edges of, but could not move. "I was just following orders," he said. She let that sit in the air for 3 full seconds before she said, "That phrase has a poor track record at trial. He broke not all at once, but in the particular way that men break when the structure they've been using to hold themselves together has been removed piece by piece until there's nothing left to stand on. And he told her about Holt's program, how it worked, how deputies who didn't bring in cash had their shifts cut, how Holt kept a private ledger of every seizure and split it according to a formula that bore no relationship to anything a court had authorized, how the local judge took referral fees, and the county prosecutor had been given a house in his wife's name. She slid a single sheet across the table. The deal. Full cooperation, full accounting of every victim, every dollar, every name in exchange for a sentencing recommendation that was not immunity, not freedom, but a number that was survivable if he was lucky and consistent and told the absolute truth from this moment forward. Quill's hand shook when he signed it. While he was signing the clip Della Pruitt had posted was crossing 600,000 views. 2 national networks had dispatched crews to Cedar Ridge. The governor's emergency press conference at 4 p.m. was by all accounts going to be a performance of outrage so vigorous that it would require his staff to pretend he had not received Declan Holt's campaign contributions for the past 12 years. Sheriff Declan Holt was arrested at his ranch at 7:23 that evening, marched down his own porch steps in handcuffs, while news helicopters held steady overhead and his prize horses purchased with money taken from 47 people on a Texas highway were led out of his stables behind him. The image of Holt descending those steps, his face the particular shade of a man who has just understood that impermanence was always the truth of power, ran on every broadcast in the state before midnight. In the ranch's wall safe behind a painting of a cowboy that cost more than the average Cedar Ridge resident made in a year, the agents found cash offshore transfer receipts and a small velvet box containing a tarnished FBI lapel pin that had not belonged to Holt and had no business being there. The serial number traced to a special agent named Barrett Kane, missing in Cedar Ridge County for 11 years. Delaney closed her hand around the box and put it in her pocket, and didn't speak for a long time. Declan Holt had spent 23 years building a life on the understanding that Cedar Ridge was his, not in the legal sense, because the legal sense was a formality he had long since learned to dress in the right paperwork, but in the fundamental territorial sense of a man who has never been moved, and therefore genuinely cannot conceive of the possibility. The ranch was the physical expression of that understanding: 3 floors, a wraparound porch, 140 acres of prime grazing land, pedigree, cattle quarter horses with names, a fishing pond stocked with fish he never caught because the having of them was sufficient. It was a place built by a public servant on a public servant's salary, and the math of that had never appeared to concern anyone in Cedar Ridge, which told you everything you needed to know about the infrastructure of looking away that Holt had spent 2 decades constructing deputy by deputy, judge by judge, favor by favor. All of it dismantled in 4 hours. The federal agents who swept his property moved with the brisk impersonal efficiency of people executing a plan made well in advance, and the things they carried out of his house boxes of files, bagged hard drives, the ledger from the wall safe that itemized every transaction in the highway. Interdiction program going back to its inception were not just evidence. They were the complete and documented history of what Cedar Ridge had been laid out in Holt's own handwriting, which he had kept with the meticulous care of a man who trusted his own impunity more than he trusted his memory. The velvet box had shaken everyone. Barrett Kane had been a well-liked agent, 31 years old, working a routine civil rights investigation in East Texas when he disappeared. His case had been officially listed as a missing persons matter, but the kind of missing persons matter that sits at the back of a filing cabinet and accrues dust because the county that should have been the most interested in solving it was the county that had the most interest in not solving it. Finding his lapel pin in Holt's safe did not close the case, but it opened the ground at the hunting cabin, and what the excavation team found there over 3 days was something that transformed the charges from corruption into something far older and far darker. Quill's cooperation sessions ran for 12 hours across 3 days. He told them everything because he had signed his name to a deal, and because he understood with the clarity that tends to arrive when the walls are very close and getting closer, that the only currency he had left was information. The testimony was devastating in the particular way that insider testimony always is. Not because it revealed things that were impossible to believe, but because it confirmed in precise and documented detail things that had been believed and unprovable for years. 47 confirmed victims, 38 of them black. All out of state. All stopped on the same 3-mile stretch of I-10. Total cash seized and misappropriated $340,000. Each victim would receive full restitution plus interest, which meant that Jalen's $8,400 in tuition money, seized on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago in front of a 10-year-old boy, was coming back, plus the particular additional weight of knowing it had been accounted for and named. Delaney sat in the federal field office in Houston and read the complete victim list, all 47 names and the amounts taken from each one, and she sat with it for a long time before she closed the folder. Because the numbers were not just numbers, they were every conversation someone had had with themselves about whether it was worth reporting every calculation made about who would be believed, every decision to absorb the loss and keep moving. She put the folder down and called Jalen. Jalen opened the door looking better than he had sounded on the phone 3 weeks ago. Steadier, more present, the particular groundedness of someone who has moved from the acute phase of a bad thing into the longer, slower work of figuring out what to do with it. He had been working with a victim's advocate. He had started the restitution paperwork. He had also, Delaney noticed, started cooking again. The apartment smelled like something good, which was in her experience a reliable indicator that a person had decided to continue inhabiting their own life. She asked about Benji. Jalen tilted his head toward the backyard. He's out back. He's been out there most of the afternoon. She found him alone at the back fence, kicking a soccer ball against the boards in a steady, meditative rhythm. 2 touches, pause. 2 touches, pause, the way kids do when they're not really playing but need something to do with their body while their mind works through something. He looked smaller than she expected, or maybe it was just that she had been carrying around an image of him for 3 weeks that had grown larger than the actual boy. She sat on the back steps and watched him for a while, without saying anything. The afternoon light was going long. The shadows from the fence posts stretched across the dry grass, the air carrying the particular quality of early evening in a Texas summer, still warm but no longer aggressive about it. She didn't ask him how he was doing. She had learned over 9 years of talking to people who had been through difficult things that "how are you doing" was a question that demanded a performance of recovery rather than an honest accounting of the present moment. She asked him if he wanted to know what had happened to the officer who stopped Uncle Jalen. Benji stopped kicking the ball. He held it against his chest and came to sit beside her on the steps, and she told him plainly, carefully, in the language of facts, rather than the language of outrage, because children who have witnessed real things deserve real information rather than an age-appropriate version that leaves them feeling managed. The officer was going to prison. The sheriff who allowed it was going to prison. The money that was taken was being returned. Benji sat with this for a long moment, turning it over. Then he asked in the measured, deliberate voice of someone who has been thinking about a specific question for 3 weeks, and is finally in a position to ask it. Did anyone stop him, or did he just get caught? Delaney thought about Della Pruitt and the 2 years between the first time she drove past and the day she stopped. She thought about the 14 complaints that had gone nowhere. She thought about the answer she wanted to give, and the answer that was true. Someone stopped him, she said. That's why they caught him. Benji nodded. He looked at the soccer ball in his hands for a moment, then held it out to her. They played in the yard as the light went golden and the shadows stretched long across the grass, kicking the ball back and forth in the particular easy silence of 2 people who have understood something together and don't need to keep talking about it. Before he went inside for dinner, he stopped at the back door and looked at her with the particular directness that certain children have the ones who have decided to take the world seriously. "Can girls be FBI?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, like a person filing something away for future use. The federal courthouse in Houston was everything Cedar Ridge was not: glass and steel and cold, climate-controlled air that carried no smell of anything human. The architecture of a building that existed specifically to host the collision between what people had done and what the law intended to do about it, built deliberately impersonal because the law is supposed to apply without favor to anyone who stands beneath its ceiling. Delaney sat in the back row in civilian clothes because this moment did not belong to her. It belonged to the 47 names in the victim impact statements stacked on the prosecution table, and to the people behind those names who now occupied the gallery, filling it quietly, the way water fills a space in ones and twos and small family groups that had driven from across Texas and beyond to be present for the formal accounting of something that had been done to them and had never until now been officially acknowledged as wrong. Jalen was in the third row in a suit he had pressed himself. Benji was not there. Delaney had arranged that with Jalen weeks earlier because some endings were for the people who had lived through the middle, and a 10-year-old boy's job right now was to kick a soccer ball in a backyard and ask questions about careers, not to sit in a federal courtroom and watch the machinery of consequence work at its measured pace. Quill entered, looking like a version of himself that had been stored incorrectly thinner, pale, the strut gone his hands, slightly ahead of him in the instinctive way of a man accustomed to cuffs, even on a day when he wasn't wearing them. He read his prepared statement of remorse with the flat affect of someone reciting from a document written by their lawyer, and the words, "genuine regret." "Understand the pain I caused, committed to making it right," landed in the gallery with the particular hollowness of things that arrive 3 convictions too late. Judge Kira Moss had been on the federal bench for 19 years and had a reputation for sentences that fit crimes with the precision of tailored clothing no larger than necessary and no smaller than honest. She was a black woman in her early 60s with silver locks and the expression of someone who had heard every variety of explanation for why a person had done what they had done and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. She listened to the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, a downward departure based on cooperation, the prosecutors citing the breadth and value of Quill's testimony against Holt, and she looked at Quill for a long time without speaking. Then she said that she had listened to the dashcam audio. Not read the transcript, listened to the audio. Listened to the laughter specifically. The way it came out of him relaxed loose at home when he believed he was in the presence of someone who had no recourse and no audience. She said that cooperation offered only after arrest was not a moral choice but a practical one, and that the court would not confuse the two. She rejected the recommendation. She sentenced Quill to a term that would return him to the world if he survived it as an old man. She ordered his assets liquidated immediately: the boat, the truck, the property, the pension, every dollar of it redirected to the 47 people in the record. She ordered him to a federal facility whose reputation among defense attorneys was efficiently summarized by its nickname, which she did not use. The gallery did not cheer. There was a long silence. The particular silence of people who have been waiting for something for long enough that receiving it requires a moment of adjustment, and then one by one they began to stand. Delaney placed the velvet box containing Barrett Kane's lapel pin on the prosecution table as the verdict was read. She didn't explain the gesture. It was not for explanation. It was for the record, the complete record, all of it going back further than Cedar Ridge wanted to go. The afternoon outside the courthouse was the kind of bright that makes everything look like the first day after something ends, the specific quality of light that arrives when a long-held tension has finally resolved and the world, which had been holding its breath, exhales. Jalen found her on the steps. He didn't lead with thank you, which she appreciated because thank you would have put her at the center of something that had always been about the 47 people in the gallery and the decade of mornings before this one that they had not had this. He told her instead what he'd been working on. His second-year research focus had shifted to civil asset forfeiture reform, to the gap between the constitutional standard and the operational reality, to the specific granular ways that laws designed for one purpose get redirected toward another when no one is watching closely enough. He said it with the particular energy of someone who has taken a terrible personal experience and decided, rather than being consumed by it, to make it the center of their life's work. She laughed genuinely, the first full laugh she'd had since Chicago, and told him that was the most Jalen Voss thing she'd ever heard. Then she told him about the restitution, the formal notification, his $8,400 plus interest plus a formal written acknowledgement from the federal government that the seizure had been unlawful, conducted without cause or legal basis, and that the officer responsible had been convicted on federal charges. Not just a check, an acknowledgement. A piece of paper that said, "This happened. It was wrong. It is named." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Benji asked me yesterday if he could go to the library to get books about the FBI. Not because of the news, because of something you said to him." Delaney was quiet at this. Della Pruitt was also on the courthouse steps, which was not something Delaney had expected. She had driven 4 hours from the next county, because she said she had decided that driving toward things instead of past them was going to be her practice from now on, and this had seemed like the right place to start. She approached Delaney with the direct, slightly awkward energy of someone who has rehearsed a speech and then decided mid-approach to abandon it. She extended her hand. "I should have stopped sooner," she said. "I saw it before, 2 years ago. I kept driving." Delaney shook her hand and held it for a moment. "You stopped when it counted," she said. It was not absolution. Della didn't ask for it, and Delaney wasn't offering it. But it was something real. A small bridge built across 2 years of a silence that had finally, at a particular gravel shoulder at 11:48 on a July morning, been broken. If this story has moved you, if you believe that the people who finally stop and the people who never stopped asking questions and the 10-year-old boys who go quiet when they should be loud are all part of the same thing that we need to fix together, then please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because the only way these stories reach the people who need to hear them is if the people who already heard them pass them on. Back in Cedar Ridge, the interim sheriff, a former Texas Ranger named Bria Calloway, who had grown up 2 counties over and returned to law enforcement after a career in state-level investigations with the specific energy of someone with unfinished business, had fired 7 deputies in 2 weeks. The duty to intervene policy was printed on a single sheet of paper and posted to the department bulletin board without ceremony or announcement, because Calloway believed that the right policies didn't require speeches. They required consequences, and the consequences were already part of the document. Delaney drove the 3-mile stretch of I-10 one final time before heading back to Quantico. Hands at 10 and 2, exactly at the limit. Windows down. The pine trees moving slightly in a wind that had come in from the east. No cruiser pulled out behind her. The road was just a road. USP Greenwall sat in a flat expanse of ground west of Houston and looked from the road like a place designed by someone who wanted to make it absolutely clear what it was: concrete and fence, and the absence of anything soft, a building that had given up on the idea of ambiguity. Quill had been in protective custody, the SHU, which was the name the Bureau of Prisons used for solitary confinement when it wanted the paperwork to sound less like what it was since his transfer 6 weeks earlier. Protective custody because he was an ex-officer, and ex-officers in general population had a life expectancy that could be measured in days, which meant that his protection was not a kindness, but a liability management decision, which he understood, and which did not make the 12-by-7 cell feel larger. The days had a texture that he hadn't anticipated, not violent, not dramatic, but relentlessly, precisely small. 1 hour of recreation, 3 meals through a slot. The sounds of the facility constant and indifferent mechanical locks, engaging boots on concrete shouting from somewhere that never resolved into words. No one spoke to him. The guards addressed him as inmate with the flat professionalism of people who had learned that the most powerful thing they could do was to simply apply the rules without modification in either direction. Officer Reyes worked the morning shift on Quill's block, young, thorough, the kind of person who became a correctional officer because they believed in the actual purpose of the institution rather than the informal traditions that had accumulated around it. He slid a manila envelope through the door slot without comment and walked on. The envelope was from a law firm in Dallas. Quill read the dissolution petition twice. Then he read the handwritten note clipped to the back, his wife's handwriting familiar and suddenly unbearably specific, and he understood without room for negotiation or reframing that this was the last thing she would ever write to him, and that it was not cruel which made it harder to hold than cruelty would have been. She was not punishing him. She was simply moving their children out of the radius of what he had made of himself, which was the only reasonable thing to do, and which he did not have any standing to dispute. He set the note down on the mattress. He sat for a long time. He thought not for the first time, but for the first time without the scaffolding of self-justification that had always been available before about Jalen Voss, about the specific look on a person's face when something is being taken from them, and they understand that arguing will make it worse, and silence will make it worse, and there is no correct response to a situation that should not be occurring. He thought about the 47 times he had produced that look on 47 different faces, and had driven away with the money and the look and the moment filed into a category called just how things work out here. He picked up the pen from the shelf. He began writing a letter he knew he would never send addressed to Jalen, itemizing, not justifying, not explaining, just itemizing what he had taken and from whom. He wrote for 2 hours. He filled 4 pages. He folded them and put them under the mattress, and he lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling of a cell that had no windows, and for the first time in his adult life the silence had weight. Benji stood at the front of his 5th grade classroom on a Thursday morning in November, a single index card in his right hand that he had not looked at once since he began talking, and he told his classmates about special agents of the FBI, specifically what they do when the people responsible for upholding the law are the ones breaking it, and his voice was clear and steady and carried to the back of the room without effort, the voice of a boy who had found something to say and was no longer waiting for permission to say it. His teacher noted afterward in her weekly log that he had spoken without looking at his card. What she did not write, because she did not have the full context, was that 3 months earlier this child had barely been speaking at all, and that whatever had shifted in him had shifted quietly and completely, the way the most important changes tend to happen, not announced, just present one day in a way that made the absence obvious in retrospect. The 3-mile stretch of Interstate 10 outside Cedar Ridge looked the same as it had always looked, the Big Earl's BBQ billboard still standing, the pine trees still thick on either side, the heat still rising off the asphalt in waves that made the road ahead look like a promise that kept retreating. But the cruiser was gone from behind the billboard, and travelers moved through without the cold particular prickle of awareness that certain roads had always produced in certain people, the instinctive inventory of cash and receipts, and how well they could articulate their reason for being here. They drove through at the posted limit and continued on their way, which was all any road was ever supposed to permit. Delaney stood at the podium in Quantico in front of a new class, the dash cam footage running on the screen behind her Quill's platinum-haired face, frozen mid-laugh in the pause she always used. She said the same thing she had said to a 10-year-old boy in a backyard with a soccer ball in the same plain language because plain language was the only kind worth using. Someone stopped him. That's why they caught him. That someone is going to be you. She clicked the remote. The screen went dark. The room was very still.